welcome to my YouTube channel. If you're new around here, my name is Katie. I'm a full-time sketchbook artist, and today I'm going to be doing a full sketchbook tour of this mixed media sketchbook. So I do have a lot of sketchbook tours on my channel. I'll leave the playlist down below and up in the cards. But I've not done a sketchbook tour of this one. So usually I split my sketchbook tours into two, especially with the Royal Talents because there's so many pages. There were 64 pages in this one, so I could have split it in two, but I didn't. But it does mean that this has taken me quite a long time to fill. But first, let me talk about the type of sketchbook this is. So I've kept this in the front just so I can always refer back to it, but this is the Strathmore 500 series mixed media sketchbook, and I have absolutely loved it. It works really well with so many different mediums. It handles a lot of wet mediums as well, so I was using a lot of watercolour in here and gouache and a lot of ink as well, and I didn't find the paper ever buckled. So I definitely recommend this sketchbook. This is the 7.75 inch by 9.75 inch. I actually bought this when I was in New York a couple of years ago because I couldn't find it here, but I have since found it here on Amazon, and I love this sketchbook so much that I've bought another one because I've now finished it. And I know I do still have a lot of sketchbooks that I have that are blank to use, but because I love this so much, I have bought another one so I can fill it because I know it handles so much and I do throw a lot at my sketchbooks. As a mixed media artist, it is quite important for me to know I've got a sketchbook that can handle whatever I want. Otherwise, I do reach for some of my other sketchbooks when I know exactly what mediums I'll be using. So that's a little bit about the sketchbook itself. They do it in other sizes, but this one is the soft cover. So it is a little bit bendy and flexible. I don't mind that, but if you prefer a hard cover, then obviously this has less support. Because it is a soft cover, you can see the front is quite dented and very well loved. Again, not something that bothers me. It is a working sketchbook, so it's not going to be perfect. So before I show you some of the artwork, I started this in December 2022, so almost 2 years of me filling this. And that's because I work in other sketchbooks, and as I said, I reach for sketchbooks depending on my mediums. And that's okay. It's totally fine if it takes you 2 years or 20 years to fill a sketchbook. You still get that accomplishment at the end when it's filled, whether it took you that long or not. And actually, I think it's a really good thing because I can see what my artwork was like 2 years ago versus today. And I think seeing that progression is really important, and it's one of my favourite things about sketchbooks. So I can really see my progression and see how my skills have developed from 2 years ago to the end of this sketchbook. So I really enjoy working in that way. But yes, it has been quite a while since I started this one. So I think there's going to be some interesting art that I'm going to remember as we go through. So this is the first spread that I painted in here. I remember this one because it was after coming back from New York, and one of my patrons had requested a tutorial for painting snow. So I filmed it and I created a tutorial for this spread. I really love this one. It's got those lovely soft winter vibes. I really like the soft pastel blues and these sort of turquoisey greens. Feels very cool, but I like the warmth that's added in from this sunset. I think this was just gouache and coloured pencils, so pretty simple. A nice way to start the sketchbook, especially during the winter. If you have any questions for each page, I'm going to do this pretty speedy, but I will try and mention the materials I'm using as I go. This was from another Patreon session. This was a live stream, I think. We were drawing different places all around the world, so I think I was doing winter around the world. This was in Japan, so this is Kyoto, and I'm not sure where this is, but these were very fun. I can definitely see how my confidence has grown. Again, that's because I can see the progression. So 2 years ago, I can see I was still a little bit timid, and I probably wouldn't approach these in the same way now, which is a really good thing. I really like being able to see that. Really like the patterns over here with this one. That's really fun. And there's a little car there. This one is a bit boring to me. I tried to add some interest in the water. Maybe I would crop it differently now. But I used some pan pastel here. I think that was when I was just starting to get into pan pastel, and then some gouache. So I don't think I had my watercolours at this point because that's still a very new medium for me, so gouache was definitely my go-to. Pretty sure these were timed as well. And we've got this one. I can see this is definitely more confident. I really like this one. This was with a pink acrylic base using just normal acrylic paint and then gouache on top. I really like this one. This was referenced from a photo I took on a walk. Just nice vibes. I really like the richness. I think there's also some lovely textures down here, and then I went on top with coloured pencil for some of these details here with the trees. I've made a print of this one available in my Etsy shop as well, so I'll leave a link to that down below. And then this one, let me turn it the right way around. This was when I was experimenting a lot, so I wonder if I was doing my daily challenge at this point. I think I was, because I remember doing these experiments for underwater and the sea. I had some new materials to experiment with from a trip to London, and also some oil pastels. So I think I picked up some oil pastels there as well as some ink. This was really fun. I really love these pops of really bright oil pastels here, and then playing with some of my mark making. And I just really like the colours, so I think it still gives those sort of undersea vibes, even though it's very different colours to what you would normally use, as in like blues and greens. It's got the greens, the pinks and the yellows. But I did throw a lot of mediums at this and the paper held up really, really well. There's a slight sheen to the page. That's because I did seal it because of the oil pastels. So these aren't coming up now because I did seal it with fixative, and I just used a spray fixative for that. Another one from a Patreon session. I love this one. These are some wildflowers, again with gouache, and then I went over the top with my near colours. So again, trying to highlight some pops of colour, and I just kind of go over the lines I've already got. I've got the lemon yellow, the sky blue and the pink here. I really like this as a spread. I can see that I was confident doing this. I think I can always tell when it's a subject that I feel comfortable with, and wildflowers are definitely that. This one was really fun. I remember this session because it looked like we have a little shrimp here, just from one of the references, so that was fun. But yeah, just a really nice one. I like this spread. Some more experiments with ink. This was traditional ink. I'd had two, I think they were Rover and Klingner inks that I was just playing around with. So I had a green and an ochre, and just seeing how I could combine them. You can see that the paper holds up really, really nicely. I also used a dip pen just to make some of these thinner marks here. But really fun, just nice to experiment and do some little studies like this. So I don't think I had any references. I was just playing with my marks and using my brush to create these shapes. I really need to do more things like this. This page is a bit of a mess. This one especially, this is again sealed because of the oil pastel. So I used oil pastel for the blue and the yellow. And then this was, it looks like the ink again. So I was trying to paint gorse, which I think is a really tricky subject, and I wasn't successful here, but it was fun to play around with the textures. Again, so much ink went on here, and again the paper didn't buckle, so that's why I love this sketchbook so much. And yeah, just playing around with some of the marks. It's not finished, I didn't bother finishing it, so that's why this feels a little bit undone towards the bottom. And then this one I filmed, and it's here on YouTube. It was a comparison of Sennelier and Pentel oil pastels. I'll link that up in the cards. And this is very different for me, but very fun. Again, I can see there's a slight sheen on this where I did seal it with fixative again. Anytime I use oil pastels, because they are so sticky and I don't want them to transfer, I will seal it. But I don't bother with any other mediums, just with oil pastels. So I used loads of different techniques on here. I used a resist technique, so there's some gouache with the oil pastel underneath. I also used some pencil on top to try and carve in. So this was a good experiment, but again, it doesn't feel very me, but it was helpful to work out the differences with those oil pastels. Okay, I really love this one. I shared this again on Instagram recently. This was actually using acrylic paint, so I actually had some tester pots that I just bought from a DIY store, and I used that pink as the base layer, and then I went on top. So actually I think it's gouache on top of acrylic paint. Again, I really like that medium. I've used that quite a few times. Pretty certain that's what this is. So the tester pot as the base and then gouache on top. Just traditional gouache. I didn't have any acrylic gouache at this point, but I really like this. It feels very soft and calm. I'm really happy with this tree. I do sometimes struggle with trees, but this one came together really nicely. I like the composition, and there's this sweet little bird down here I added on with collage. I'll just do a close-up of that little guy. He was added on using my paint palette sheet, so I always keep those, and then I can cut out little collage elements from it. Oh, I love this spread. Again, there is a process video here on YouTube. I'll leave that in the cards. I won't be able to link everything in the cards, but they will all be listed down below in the description. If you see my work, you'll know that I love working in this way. It's like a travel journal / journal vibe. So I will document my days in my sketchbook by adding in some journaling and also kind of collating my pictures together and creating it in this way. So we've got a landscape here, and then the White Horse Trail, which was the walk that we went on. And I really like the way this is, how it's kind of undone. I like including signage, things like food and like wildflowers into these spreads, along with some colour palettes and then my writing. Really, really happy with this cow here. Probably the best cow I've ever drawn. And yeah, just a really happy spread. And I like documenting my days in this way because it really helps me to remember them. Okay, so on the left, we can see we're at May now. So it's taken me from December to May to fill these pages. I wasn't working in it consistently, just grabbing it when I wanted to. Luckily, I've written here what I've done. So masking fluid and acrylic ink experiments with Derwent Inktense pencils. So these frames, like window frames, were done with the masking fluid and then acrylic ink on top. I was also experimenting with the Derwent Inktense pencils of dipping them in the water, which worked really, really nicely, and when the ink was still wet, it definitely activated the colour there. I really like these, they're playful, I like the colours, I like the pops of pink, and playing with masking fluid is a really fun one for me, definitely something I don't use often, but always enjoy when I do. This is unfinished. This was done as an experiment for an exhibition I had coming up, and I didn't bother finishing this one. Sometimes I do push through, but this one I just didn't. I think I was waiting for it to dry and I just didn't come back. And you'll also notice there are a few empty pages in this sketchbook that I just haven't filled. Again, it's a working sketchbook and I'm not too worried about it. Another one, which is that sort of journal style. This one I did with my patrons, so we filled this together on a Zoom session using some references I took when I visited here with my family. So I really enjoy putting in the little titles in different typography, adding in the date, and again those colour swatches, which are just purely for aesthetic reasons. I would probably do it a little bit different now, especially down here. Feels like it needs a bit more contrast, but I really love these flowers, and I like this long one here, especially with the tree coming out of it, so I haven't kept it in the panel, and I really like the way that works, especially with the text sort of fitting in around the shapes I've painted in. Some floral studies. You can see here, a lot of people think my sketchbook is really neat and clean, but if you look closer up, you can see it's definitely dirty where things have smudged and spread. And again, it's a working sketchbook, so it's going to get messy and muddy. I do tend to put in pieces of paper like I do with my Royal Talons, just to try and stop it transferring too much, but it's going to sometimes, I'm going to inevitably forget. But generally I do put scrap paper here, so anything that will transfer from pressure on the other side will transfer onto the scrap paper instead of the art. This was all done with gouache and then coloured pencils on top. I think I did use some Derwent Inktense pencils, judging by the texture, so it gives a really nice textured line compared to just normal coloured pencils. And again, I've labelled everything up, and these were sent to me on Twitter, I remember. They're from a botanical greenhouse in France. Someone worked there and I asked if I could draw from their plants because they sent them to me and they said yes. So this was really fun. I like some of these colour combos. Here's an example of an empty spread. So I did these swatch tests and these blending experiments when I was comparing this sketchbook with another one. So I think that's a really good video to watch if you want to see the comparisons. So I will link that one up in the cards. I was comparing it with, I think, an Etcher one and the Royal Talon. So if you want to see the differences, that's a really good video because this is really white paper and usually I work on ivory paper. But I don't find any issue swapping between. So that's what this one was. And generally I will work on a double page spread. That's my preference. And because the next one was a double page spread, I then skipped this one and I just forget to come back to fill in the pages later on. I just tend to work forward, so I think a lot of them are double page spreads and I forget about the pages I've left empty. I don't love this one, but it's okay. I think there's a video for this one. This was done with Tombow, so again, this paper works really well with Tombows. There wasn't much pilling, but obviously using brush pens in any sketchbook, you have to be careful with that. I think the colour palette's very different for me, so it was nice to see that I've pushed out my comfort zone with that. And then, yeah, just built up the colours, the richness of the colour, and then added some coloured pencils on top. Again, documenting a little day trip I had, so we went to the beach. This was May 2023, adding a little bit more journaling, which really helps me feel that connection with my sketchbook because it feels so much more personal. Then we've got this one. So we went from May 2023 to August because I remember, oh yeah, I've got the date here. This was for a Patreon session where we were doing settings for the month, so practicing those. So we did an urban scene and then an interiors. I really like these. There's a random chicken here as well. This was done with gouache and then coloured pencils on top. Definitely my comfort mediums, which is why you'll see me use those a lot. And I really like this. The perspective is a bit off. That's okay. I never worry about angles and things. But I like the colour palette. It feels nice and soft. And I don't often draw interiors, so this was a fun challenge. Red Pandas. I love this one. So this was when I had got my watercolours. So this was using Kuretake watercolours. There is a process video for this one, but over on my Patreon. I really love these, very fun. I need to do more of these. I didn't sketch first, so the paint went down and then I tried to refine it with the coloured pencils. And I think that's a really nice way to work. It keeps me nice and loose. It does mean that they're not perfect, but I'm pretty happy with how they turned out. And I like the bamboo leaves and the grass I've used to fill the gaps in between. So a really, really fun one. Definitely think of this one fondly, and I love that I have the process video for it too. Sometimes it's really nice to look back to see how I've done it because I'm usually so in the zone that I don't really think about it. Some experiments here for my Christmas card, which again I need to do this year's as well if I'm going to do it and find some time, but I didn't go ahead with either of these because they felt too spring-like. I don't know why I was doing rabbits, but I wanted to try and combine sort of winter scenes with colour. I just don't think it was successful, but there's this one which was done with gouache and coloured pencils, and then some rabbits and some flowers. So tend to draw different elements and then place it together in Photoshop. But like I said, this one didn't become the Christmas card. We've got another empty spread here, and then this one, which was done purely with Tombows and some coloured pencils. I absolutely love this. It's very, very different for me, and I think Instagram didn't like how different it was. But for me, I'm really proud of it. There's lots of different layering, so I layered a lot of the Tombows together to create new shades, and then did these snowy owl studies. So there's lots of colour, and this one does take a long time to put together, so it's a lot slower than if I was using paint, and it's also a lot more controlled, so I think that's why it feels so different for me. I did always mean to come back to fill in another study like this using Tombows over here and another bird study, but because it takes so long I just haven't, and I haven't done something like this since. But it did handle the Tombows really well. As I said, you do have to be careful with pilling, but because this paper is 190 GSM, it handled it pretty well, and I was really happy. Okay, I definitely have a YouTube video of this one. This was talking about finding colours in nature and doing studies of things that you find. So I did a little neighbourhood walk and picked up a few things, took lots of photos, and then drew them in my sketchbook. I really like this. As I said in my video from a couple of weeks ago about ideas to fill your sketchbook, I think doing these seasonally and finding colour at the beginning of each season is a really nice thing to do, and changing up your colour palettes, and this really focuses on the colours, so definitely something I want to do again. These were done with watercolour, so these are my Kuretake Gansai Tambi watercolours. I like the looseness of the watercolour, they really help me to be a bit more free with my painting, and then I like the texture here with the Scotch pine as well. Some really lovely colours, and yeah, really happy with this spread. Okay, this one, we'll talk about this one in a moment, but let's start over here. So I was doing some lichen studies, however you want to say it. And again, I like these. I picked up a little twig with all this on, and then I drew it in various sort of scales. So I was trying to zoom in each time to try and show off all these little details. It's amazing how much is on this tiny piece of branch in terms of the textures and the colours. We were doing texture month on Patreon, I think, at this time, so I was really focused on textures, and I used my watercolours here as well. I really love some of these details, and I did also add in some labels, but really happy with this one. And then over here on the right, I was playing with my gel plate. So I had received a gel plate from Mitch for Christmas, and I think this was February, so I finally decided to bite the bullet and just play. And because it was texture month, it was perfect for that. I think I was planning on working on top, but it doesn't really need it. It was just a playful experiment using acrylic paint and just trying to play with that texture. So there are elements where it's flaked off and just trying to be natural with it. So using these studies to influence it especially with the lichen. And yeah, I mean, it's very different to have in my sketchbook than anything else, but I know this was an experiment when I first got my gel plate. So because it was texture month on Patreon, I did 2 different studies. So I did hard textures versus soft textures. This was during our Zoom call. We've got replays for all of these if you are interested in doing them with me. But this one was the hard texture and this one was the soft. So this was soft pastels and coloured pencils, but built up slowly. And there's some watercolour here too. Whereas this one was with gouache and maybe some acrylic paint. There's some collage here as well, some dough and ink tints. Just trying to get the harder textures, so trying to be a bit more scratchy, trying to be a bit more defined with my lines, whereas this one I built up a bit more slowly. I find it really fascinating doing the same reference twice and using different techniques and ideas. So here I was focused on textures, but you can also do it with totally different mediums, which I also did because this one was with soft pastel. I don't know which I prefer because they both do different things. This one gives a much more dreamlike, softer image, whereas this one feels, I don't know if it's just a bit more fun and there's more texture, which I also really like. But I think this is a nice spread to look at and to compare. Okay, so over here was when I was testing out Faber-Castell gelatos for the first time. I have a video on this one sharing different techniques for using them. So they are water soluble. So this peach down here was using the water with them. This one was blending, I think, on the page and also using water. And then this one was just using them as is with a blending stick. And I like these. I really think it's fun to experiment when you get new supplies and learn how to use them with your style and how you want to work with them. So that's what I did here, and that's definitely how I work best and learn the best. So a really helpful spread for me and a fun video to make when I'm trying something completely different. And then here, I actually did fill this last week, so I wanted to just do a quick study and I noticed there was this big gap. Didn't bother with the other ones, but this one I did, and this was just using my Kuretake watercolours and just doing a study of a bouquet that Mitch had bought me for announcing my book. So a little plug here, I do have my first ever book coming out next March. So March 2025, pre-orders are open now. It's all about sketchbooking and I'm incredibly proud of it. So I'll leave a link to that down below as well. But I love this one. It feels nice and loose. It took 20 minutes, 10 minutes for the base layer, left it to dry and then came back later on in the afternoon for another 10 minutes to add on the details. And when I'm really, really busy, that's the best way for me to work, is to slot it in around some of my tasks. And because I have to wait for watercolour to dry, that's why I did it in 2 lots. But I like this, it's got that energy which I really like, and it doesn't feel too precious. This was a Patreon drawing session in March, so we skipped ahead. You can definitely see that I've got gaps in between where I don't touch this sketchbook, and then I use it all the time. So it does depend on what I'm using. But this was drawing from life, so that was our theme for March earlier this year. I love this. I'm really, really fond of this one. I also worked in my PIS sketchbook, so I worked in a few different sketchbooks in this session. This was using watercolour, I think, and coloured pencils on top, and doing observational studies of our own little still lives. So this feels quite personal to me because I've got these elements and these things around me on my desk, and it was nice to do observation studies. I had a really lovely time that month. Drawing from life isn't something I do normally, and it was just really nice to do it. And although the angles aren't perfect, I really love the colours. I like having these elements together. And yeah, I really like this one. I like some of the textures here. So I think some of this was with dough and ink tints pencils and then coloured pencils as well, just to try and get some of the details. And I also like the sketches here when I was practicing composition. Then I went to Japan on my honeymoon and came back, and we did Japan month on Patreon, and these were done during that session using some of my photos. So this was using Kuretake Gansai Tambi watercolours, so I had changed my palette. So this originally was the Art Nouveau set. Then I went to Japan and bought some new colours out there, so then I bodged this and hacked it to create my own colour palette. So some of these colours, especially like this blue, were new, and I wanted to test them out and use watercolour here for the Japan photos. I like these. There's a really nice softness. You can see I was being loose. These were definitely timed studies, so that's why they're a little bit maybe too loose. I didn't have a load of time to add onto them, but I really like them. Definitely brings me back some lovely memories from my honeymoon. This was a mountain tutorial, so May 2024, here I've already written it. So I filmed a tutorial for my patrons of how to paint mountains. This was done, top one was done using acrylic markers. This one was a bit of soft pastel, and there's also some beige Posca there and a little bit of watercolour by the looks of it. This one was gouache, and this was also gouache, but showing like a foresty green mountain compared to some of these ones. They're all Japanese mountains. This was using my sister's reference, this was using my reference, and then these two I think are stock images. But just a nice way to practice texture and teach my patrons how we can paint mountains using different mediums. There's definitely a spread and a process for this one here on YouTube. This was when I was using my Sailor Fude de Manin pen. So this fountain pen has a nib which is at a 55-degree angle, so you can see it's bent, which makes it look like I've broken it, but it's supposed to be like that because it creates a really lovely variation of line. And I use my watercolours on top just to try and get that looseness. So I put down my ink first and then went on top with the watercolours. So there is a process of this one. Again, it's different for me because I don't often focus on line, but I love it when I do because it creates this totally different style, but I really like it. It feels very urban sketchy, and I don't know, I think it works well with architecture and also with nature here. I like some of the textures and the scribbles in the trees. So really fun to use the fountain pen for the first time and to create a spread like this. Again, another one I've definitely filmed. This was using my new Stabilo Boss highlighters, so they came out with a nature set. Again, that is on my channel. But you can see all the colours here, which definitely you wouldn't think are highlighters, but they've come out with this nature set. So I decided to use just those and then some coloured pencils on top. Some really nice textures here. It was nice to use something different because usually I use brush pens with the tapered tip, whereas I didn't have that with the highlighters. So it's definitely a different style for me to try and use this really blunt end, but it did feel like it wasn't completely new for me because I usually use brush pens. It was nice to build it up, and I do like the colour palette. Some more studies. This was in August, so we were doing Water Life Month over on Patreon, and this was on a YouTube session, a YouTube live. I love some of the textures. It was really fun to create some of these marks, so I went in not really expecting much, and then I was pleasantly surprised with how this came together. So this was putting water down and then adding some Derwent Inktense pencils and colour on top. So some really nice textures here. We've got some fish and then some seaweed studies. Here I'm using the Derwent Inktense block. I'm just going to hold that up close so you can see what I'm talking about with the textures. But I really love this. I think there's some really nice mark making in here, which I'm constantly talking about mark making because that's something that really interests me. And it's nice to have some of the soft with the harsh as well here. And I just like this spread. I think it came together really nicely. This one, I haven't sealed it. I probably should because it's definitely still coming off. But now I finished the sketchbook, I don't think it matters so much. But this was also filmed for YouTube when I was testing out the big chunky XL graphite blocks by Derwent. So again, it's very different atmosphere for me, very moody, and obviously that's my namesake, but I really enjoyed playing with them. Again, first time I'd used them, so I just wanted to go all out. And I think it's very easy to look things up when you do get a new material, but I think you learn more when you play with them. So that's definitely what I did here, playing around with dipping them in the water, just using a paintbrush on them as if they were paint, and then applying them directly to try and get some of this variation in texture. So I really like this one. It is different for me, but I love how full it is and how atmospheric it is. Okay, this spread, complete disaster. I was playing with masking fluid. This was, again, during that Water Life month, but it didn't work out. I used a brush to apply the masking fluid, but it was too big really for some of this fine splash I was trying to get from the waves. So I think if it was small, if I had maybe one of those fine liner pens to apply it, that would work better. And then it also ripped the paper, which was a shame. So I never came back to finish this, even though I meant to. I used watercolour here so you can see the different blooms. And then I also dabbed it off with my tissue as well. So lots of different textures here, but I never came back to finish it. And again, I didn't come back to fill in this page either. Okay, so here are some of my mixed media experiments. This was filmed as part of the mini 2-part course I did here on YouTube, talking all about how I use mixed media and how I layer my mediums. So I think that's a really good video if you want to know a bit more about my process. So although these don't look like much, I actually love them. I love the colours, I love how playful they are. I don't often film my sketchbook in this way, but obviously I was trying to talk about my technique and I really like this. I think doing mini little abstract landscapes like this is a fun exercise I'd like to do again. And then last but not least is from last week's video where I finished this sketchbook. I talked all about art challenges and showed the process for this one. So this was using acrylic gouache and acrylic ink. There's also dough and Inktense pencils here and some Neocolors, but no normal colored pencils, and I used a scrubby brush which really helped me to add that texture. I really like the colours and the warmth and the way that the river flows as well. I'm really happy with that. So definitely ending this sketchbook on a high. I haven't filled in this final page. It is stuck to the cover, so I could fold it down, but I'm just not going to worry. I'm going to leave it there with this one as my final page. And there we go. That is the full sketchbook. So it's a little bit longer than a lot of my sketchbook tours because I've done it in one. But I hope you enjoyed watching. I hope you found it interesting seeing my progression and seeing like 2 years ago me versus now, because I can definitely see a bit of growth there, and it's really interesting seeing my materials change as I add things into my studio and discover that I love them and then use them more and learn how to combine them as well. Let me know if you have any questions down below, and I will leave a link to my sketchbook tour playlist as well. It might take me another 2 years to film my new one, but either way, I hope you stick around. Please do subscribe if you're interested, and I will speak to you all really soon. See you later.